The cold was the first thing that truly registered, a damp, metallic chill that seeped through threadbare clothes and settled deep into the bones. It was a different cold from the fleeting frost of the transit shuttle. This was a permanent, institutional cold, the breath of a vast and uncaring stone edifice. Anya stood on the rain-slicked courtyard flagstones, a small, solitary figure amidst a dozen other silent children, all staring up at the Schola Progenium. The building was a fortress of gray rockcrete, its narrow windows like arrow slits, its only adornment a massive, weather-stained aquila carved above the towering iron doors. There were no welcoming lights, no sounds of play, only the steady drip of rain from gargoyle spouts and the distant, rhythmic echo of marching feet from within. A heavy hand on her shoulder guided her forward with the others, a silent, robed adept herding them like lost livestock. The doors groaned open, revealing a cavernous entrance hall lit by flickering glow globes set high in a vaulted ceiling lost to shadow. The air smelled of stale incense, lye soap, and something faintly coppery. Along the walls, stern-faced portraits of imperial heroes and saints gazed down with painted eyes that seemed to follow their shuffling progress. Anya's fingers tightened around the only thing she had been allowed to keep, a small, tattered piece of parchment, a devotional image of the emperor she had torn from a ruined prayer book during the evacuation of her home world. The image was smudged, the gold leaf flaking, but his stern, benevolent gaze was the only familiar thing in this terrifying new universe. They were lined up before a raised dais where a woman stood, clad in the severe black and gray of a Schola proctor. Her face was a mask of sharp angles, her hair pulled back so tightly it stretched the skin of her temples. She did not speak for a long moment, letting the weight of the silence and the cold press down upon them. When she finally did, her voice was a dry rasp devoid of warmth, each word a measured pronouncement. "You are orphans of war," she stated, her eyes scanning their small, frightened faces. "Your progenitors served the Imperium and died in its service. You are their legacy, and now you are the property of the Emperor. Your past is ash. Your future is service. Your only family is the Imperium. Your only father is the God Emperor of mankind." The words were a catechism, repeated Anya would learn with the same regularity as the morning bell. They landed on her with physical force, extinguishing the last ember of hope that she might one day return to something resembling her old life. She was property, she was legacy, she was alone. Discipline was immediate and brutal. A boy 2 places down from Anya sniffled, a quiet, involuntary sound of despair. The proctor's gaze snapped to him. A gesture of her hand, and a hulking servitor, its flesh fused with polished chrome, lumbered forward. A single, backhanded blow from its metal limb sent the boy sprawling to the stone floor. No one cried out. No one moved to help him. The lesson was imparted without a single additional word. Sorrow was a luxury. Weakness was a sin. That night, assigned to a cell-like dormitory with a dozen other girls, Anya lay on a thin, scratchy pallet, listening to the muffled sobs of the girl in the next cot. She clutched the tattered image to her chest, staring into the dark. The fear was a living thing in her gut, cold and squirming. The loneliness was a vast, hollow ache. But beneath the terror, a tiny, desperate seed was planted. The proctor's words echoed. "Your only father is the God Emperor." In the absolute darkness, with no one else to turn to, the stern face on her crumpled parchment became a focal point. She had nothing, was nothing. But perhaps if she belonged to him completely, she could become something. The longing for belonging, kindled in the freezing dark of the orphanage, twisted itself around the first, fragile root of faith. It was not love that planted it, but terror. It was not hope that watered it, but a desperate, clawing need to not be alone in the immense, uncaring cold. She whispered the only prayer she knew, a fragment from a half-remembered liturgy, her voice a tiny thread of sound in the vast, silent hall of souls. "Emperor protect." The words felt flimsy against the darkness, but she held onto them, and onto his image, as the only anchors in a world that had ceased to make any sense at all. The scream of the reveille horn tore through the pre-dawn blackness, a sound of such brutal, metallic urgency that Anya's heart seemed to stop before hammering against her ribs in a frantic, animal panic. There was no transition from sleep to waking, only this violent ejection from the thin blanket of oblivion. The dormitory erupted into a chaos of scrambling limbs and hissed commands as the older girls, the dormitory monitors, began shoving the newer arrivals from their cots. Anya hit the cold stone floor, the impact jarring her knees. She had 30 seconds to fold her bedding into a perfect razor-edged cube, 60 to fall into line in the central aisle, standing at rigid attention. The girl next to her, Ilara, fumbled with her thin blanket. A monitor's cane cracked down on her knuckles with a sound like breaking twigs. Ilara made no sound, but her face went bone white. Thus began the first lesson. Time was not their own. It was a currency spent under the watchful, unforgiving eyes of the Schola, and debt was paid in pain. The physical training courtyard was a vast, ash-floored pit under a grim, iron-gray sky. A drill abbot, a mountain of scarred muscle clad in a sleeveless black tunic, stood before them, his voice a guttural bark that needed no amplification. The drills were simple, endless, and agonizing. They ran laps until lungs burned and vision spotted. They dropped for push-ups on the coarse ash, the grit embedding itself in the soft skin of their palms. They stood holding heavy, water-filled buckets at arm's length until the muscles in their shoulders shrieked and trembled, and the buckets crashed to the ground, spilling their contents into the thirsty ash. Failure was not an option. It was an inevitability, and each failure was met with immediate correction. A stumble during a run earned a sharp blow from the abbot's baton across the backs of the thighs. A dropped bucket meant the entire row would restart the exercise, earning the culprit the silent, seething hatred of their peers. By mid-morning, Anya's body was a tapestry of new aches. Her hands were raw, her legs leaden. Yet the physical ordeal was only the preface. The true lesson began in the doctrinal hall, a sterile room lined with benches facing a large, hololithic projection of the imperial aquila. Here, a lectitio magister droned in a monotone about the unification wars, the treachery of the heretic, the sanctity of the imperial creed. The air was thick, with the smell of ozone from the projector and the faint, sweet scent of incense meant to aid concentration. It failed. Exhaustion was a heavy wool blanket over Anya's mind. Her eyelids grew leaden. A sharp pain exploded across her knuckles. The magister stood over her, a slender, silver cane in his hand. She hadn't even seen him move. "Inattention is a lapse of faith," he stated, his voice devoid of anger, merely stating a fact. "You will not eat at the noon bell. You will remain and transcribe the catechism of obedience 100 times. The hunger that followed was a sharper, more intimate tutor than the abbot's baton. As the other children filed into the refectory to the smell of thin gruel, Anya sat alone in the silent hall, her hand cramping as she scratched the same words onto slate. Duty is its own reward. Doubt is the seed of heresy. The flesh is weak, but the spirit is willing. The words blurred. The emptiness in her stomach was a hollow, gnawing void that seemed to echo the vast loneliness within her. The afternoon brought more drills. During a complex formation change, her exhausted legs betrayed her. She stumbled, her foot twisting on a loose piece of aggregate. She did not fall, but the break in perfect unison was a glaring flaw. The drill abbot was upon her in 2 strides. No words were exchanged. He pointed to a black-stained wooden block at the edge of the yard. The caning was a ceremony of pure, distilled pain. 3 strokes delivered with practiced, efficient force. The first was a line of white-hot fire across her shoulders. The second stole her breath. The third brought hot, shameful tears to her eyes, though she choked back any sound. The pain was not just physical. It was a brand, a public declaration of her inadequacy. She returned to the line, each movement reigniting the fire on her back, her face burning with a humiliation hotter than the welts. That night, in the absolute darkness of her cell, the pain was her entire universe. It throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a constant, accusing presence. She lay on her stomach on the thin pallet, the rough fabric scratching her cheek. The tattered image of the Emperor was clutched in her trembling hand. Despair, a cold, black tide, threatened to pull her under. But then from a nearby cell she heard it, a whisper. Then another from across the dormitory block. A soft, rhythmic murmur like the distant rush of a subterranean river. They were prayers. The other children, each nursing their own private catalogue of bruises and hunger and fear, were whispering the same litanies and catechisms drilled into them by day. In the dark, the words were not rote recitations. They were lifelines, spells cast against the void. Anya's own lips began to move. She whispered the catechism of obedience she had transcribed, the words now flowing without thought. As she spoke them into the darkness, a strange alchemy occurred. The sharp, screaming pain in her back began to change. It did. Not lessen, but its meaning shifted. It was no longer just a punishment for a stumble. It was a testament. It was an offering. Her suffering was proof of her presence here, in this harsh, unforgiving place that was now her entire world. The Schola had taken everything, but it had given her this, a framework to understand the pain. It was not meaningless agony. It was a form of communication, a brutal prayer offered up on the altar of discipline. The flesh is weak, she whispered, feeling the truth of it in every burning welt. But the spirit is willing, she answered herself, the words a shield against the dark. The pain, she realized grimly, was the prayer. And in that terrible, silent chorus of whispered faith, she found a sliver of comfort, hard and sharp as a flint, but hers alone. She had endured the first lesson. She had learned its core truth. In the Schola Progenium, to suffer in silence was to pray, and to pray was to survive. Years hardened the soul like ceramite in a forge. The frightened child who clutched a tattered image in the dark was gone, her shape overwritten by ritual, drill, and doctrine. Anya stood now in a perfect line with her Progenium cohort, a single unit of 67 souls, all clad in identical gray drill fatigues, all standing at perfect attention in the Schola's grand refectory. The hall felt different today. The usual smells of boiled nutri-paste and disinfectant were overwhelmed by the scent of burning incense and the ozone tang of active auspex scanners. High above, banners of the various imperial institutions, the administratum's scroll and quill, the astra militarum's jagged sword, the adeptus mechanicus's cog, hung still in the dead air. But it was the new banner, unfurled directly behind the lectern, that held every eye, a stark, blood-red field upon which a silver fleur-de-lis gleamed under the lumiglobes, the symbol of the Adepta Sororitas. Today was the Dies Iudicii, the day of judgment. The selection. A procession entered. Schola proctors, their faces like carved stone, flanked a delegation of imperial officials. There was an administratum scribe master, his robes a waterfall of parchment, his fingers stained with ink. A grizzled commissar in a greatcoat and polished jackboots, his gaze a physical weight. And her, a palatine of the order's militant. She moved with a silence that was more imposing than any march, her power armor not the battlefield plate Anya had seen in Picts, but a form-fitting suit of black ceramite polished to a mirror sheen, edged in silver. A cloak of deep crimson fell from her shoulders. Her face was severe, handsome, and utterly devoid of mundane concern, as if carved from the same cold substance as her armor. Her eyes, gray as glacial ice, swept over the ranks, and where they passed, Anya felt a bizarre cocktail of terror and yearning. The ceremony was stark, devoid of pomp. A servitor with a Voxcaster unit for a head intoned names and designations in a buzzing monotone. With each name, a destiny was pronounced. Kara's Leo, Astra Militarum 45th Cadian. The boy's shoulders squared, a flicker of grim pride on his face before he stepped forward to stand beneath the banner of the Imperial Guard. Vex Sylvia, Administratum Departamento Exacta. A clever girl who excelled at logistics, her expression unreadable as she moved to join the scribe master's group. Anya's heart was a drumbeat against her ribs. This was the final, irrevocable sorting. The Schola had sanded them down to raw material. Now the Imperium would stamp them into their final, useful shape. She thought of Alara standing 2 places down. They were not friends. Friendship was a vulnerability ruthlessly pruned, but they were survivors of the same harsh nursery. They had shared the silent solidarity of the cane, the hungry, the endlessly drilled. In the dark, their whispered prayers had sometimes mingled. Anya, designation Sigma 7 null. The servitor's voice crackled. She stepped forward, her movements precise, automated by years of training. The Palatine's ice-gray eyes locked onto her. They did not assess, they simply consumed. The woman gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to the head proctor. Adepta Sororitas, the proctor announced, her rasping voice filling the silent hall. Order of the Ebon Chalice. A surge, violent and contradictory, erupted in Anya's chest. Pride first, a scalding, glorious wave. She had been seen, chosen. The ultimate affirmation of the Schola's harsh gospel. She was worthy of becoming a living weapon of the God Emperor. It was immediately followed by a dread so profound it felt like the floor beneath her had turned to void. The sororitas, the brides of the Emperor. Their lives were prayer and war, ending only in martyrdom. The childhood nightmares of battlefield fire and demonic whispers, once abstract, now had a destination, her future. She took her place beneath the red and silver banner. The air here smelled different, ozone, yes, but also the faint, clean scent of sacred oils and polished metal. She stared straight ahead, her profile a mask of disciplined acceptance. The selection continued. When Alara's name was called, Anya's eyes, against all protocol, flickered to the side. Alara, designation Rotu Kappa, Administratum Departamento Logis. Alara stepped forward, her face pale but composed. As she turned to join the scribe master's growing cluster, her eyes met Anya's. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. In Alara's gaze, Anya saw a reflection of her own turmoil, relief at escaping the battlefield, quickly shrouded by a deep, sorrowful understanding. Their paths, intertwined for years in shared suffering, were now diverging forever. Alara would spend her life in a silent scriptorium, her battles fought with data quills and ledgers, her body safe but her soul perhaps buried in endless lines of figures. Anya's path led to fire and blood. There was no time for words, no touch of farewell. Just that fleeting glance, a silent acknowledgement of the girl each had been, and a ghost of the friendship that had never been allowed to breathe. Then Alara looked away and the connection severed. The final name was called. The officials gathered before the selected groups. The Palatine approached the 9 girls chosen for the sororitas. Up close, her presence was immense, a monument of faith and fury. She carried no visible weapon, but she needed none. From a servitor hovering at her side, she took a silver stylus, its tip glowing with a soft, actinic light. "You are the chosen of the Emperor," the Palatine stated, her voice low but clear, etching itself into the silence. "Your lives, your deaths, your very souls are now his sacred currency. You belong to him alone." She reached out and took Anya's chin in her cold, ceramite-clad fingers, tilting her face up. There was no gentleness in the grip, only absolute ownership. The glowing stylus approached Anya's forehead, just above the bridge of her nose. Anya did not flinch. She felt the heat first, then a sharp pinpoint pain as the stylus touched her skin. The smell of seared flesh, faint and sweetly acrid, filled her nostrils. It was over in a second. The Palatine moved to the next girl. A permanent, tiny fleur-de-lis, a brand of ultimate ownership, now marked Anya's flesh. It was not a badge of honor, not yet. It was a brand like that on a piece of arsenal-grade plasteel. It signified her transfer from one cold institution to another, far more absolute one. The Schola had prepared the material. The sororitas would forge the weapon. As the Palatine finished the marking and turned away, her crimson cloak sweeping the polished floor, Anya understood with a final, chilling clarity. Her fate was no longer a path of many possible branches. It was a sealed corridor, leading only to the battlefront, and if she was faithful enough, to a glorious death. The calling was not an invitation. It was a sentence, written in fire on her skin, and she would spend the rest of her life striving to become worthy of its terrible, beautiful weight. The convent of the Ebon Chalice did not welcome. It consumed. The shuttle's ramp lowered not onto a courtyard, but into the throat of a mountain, a cavernous hangar hewn from black basalt and lit by the hellish glow of refueling promethium flames. The air vibrated with the shriek of power saws on ceramite, and the deafening, rhythmic thunder of massed bolter fire from deep within the rock. It was not a place of peace, but a forge, and its primary tool was agony. Drill Abbess Severina awaited them. She was a sculpture of scar tissue and grim purpose, her face a landscape of old burns and a single, milky eye that saw through flesh to the weakness within. The other eye was a bionic lens that glowed with a cold, red light, scanning each new arrival with a dismissive click-whir. She carried no ornate crozius, only a simple, unadorned handle of worn leather from which hung 9 tails of braided electrolash, each tip capped with a barb of dull iron. It rested against her thigh as if it were a natural extension of her arm. "You are soft," she stated, her voice a gravelly rasp that cut through the industrial din. "You are prideful, you are weak. My purpose is to burn away the first two. The Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, will determine if you are strong enough to survive the third." The burning began immediately. There were no quarters assigned, no moments of orientation. They were marched directly to the live fire drill chambers, twisting, multi-level labyrinths of rockcrete and rusted iron, lit by strobes that induced disorientation. Simulated gunfire from automated servitors tracked them, firing low-stun beams that felt like wasp stings on bare skin. The objective was always simple: reach the far end. The methods were relentlessly complex. They low-crawled through channels of icy, foul-smelling water while pyrotechnics detonated overhead. They scaled sheer walls with crumbling handholds as strobes flashed and the recorded screams of heretics played from hidden vox grills. Exhaustion was not a condition to be avoided. It was the intended state, the fertile ground where true lessons were sown. Anya learned to move through a haze of fatigue so profound it felt like drowning in warm lead. Her muscles trembled constantly. Her vision swam. Yet within that haze, a fierce, desperate focus emerged. The prayers she had whispered in the Schola's dark became mantras chanted between gasping breaths. With each low crawl through mud, she recited the litany of endurance. With each agonizing climb, the canticle of ascent. The exhaustion became a furnace, and her whispered faith was the fuel. She began to crave the drills, not for their end, but for the pure, white-hot clarity that arrived in their deepest throes. In that state there was no past, no future, no fear. Only the next handhold, the next corner, the next syllable of the litany. It was a brutal, transcendent zeal. The fire of the drilled chambers was tempered in the icy waters of the prayer halls. For hours they knelt on bare stone, reciting the entire book of judgments from memory. A stumble in verse, A moment of hesitation, and the electrolash would crack across the shoulders of the entire row. The pain was a shared sacrament, a collective atonement for a single soul's lapse. Anya's knees became masses of bruised flesh. Her voice grew hoarse, then faded to a ragged whisper, yet the words continued, formed by will alone. She learned to channel the physical agony of kneeling into the spiritual fire of the verses, each throb a metronome for her devotion. The final test came in the sparring cages. It was here, surrounded by the silent, watching ranks of her squad and the unmoving form of Abbess Severina, that Anya faced her deepest flaw. Her opponent was a fellow novice, Sister Katerina, a fierce girl with a nose already broken and reset multiple times. They fought with blunt, training knives, the goal to subdue, to demonstrate ruthless efficiency. Anya was faster. She saw an opening, a gap in Katerina's guard after a clumsy lunge. She moved in, her training knife poised for a disabling strike to the wrist. But in that fraction of a second, she saw not an opponent but a girl, a face slick with sweat and streaked with grime, eyes wide with effort and frustration. She saw Ilara. She saw the ghost of shared pain in the Schola. Her strike hesitated, softening from a disabling blow to a mere slap against Katerina's vambrace. The crack of the whip was the only sound in the suddenly silent chamber. It was not the shared sting of the prayer hall. It was a personal comet of pure, incandescent pain that exploded across Anya's back. The force drove her to her knees, the training knife clattering from nerveless fingers. The world narrowed to the fire racing along her nerves, to the smell of her own scorched fatigues. Abbess Severina stood over her, the electrolash coiled back in her hand. Her milky eye seemed to look through Anya's skull. "Mercy," the abbess hissed, the word a profanity in the quiet, "is the poison that weakens the blade of faith. That creature across from you is not your sister. She is a vessel for your doubt, your hesitation, your lingering attachment to the frailties of the flesh. When you look upon the enemy, be it heretic, mutant, or demon, you will see nothing but a flaw in the Emperor's design, a flaw you are ordained to correct. Your pity is a greater heresy than any blasphemy they might utter, for it is a betrayal of your own purpose." The pain was a cleansing fire. As Anya knelt, gasping, the last vestiges of the Schola orphan, the girl who sought connection in shared suffering, burned away in that agonizing crucible. Severina was right. Her moment of hesitation was not compassion. It was a failure of faith. It was valuing the transient pain of another over the eternal will of the God Emperor. She looked up, her eyes streaming not from pain but from the searing clarity of the lesson. She met Katerina's gaze, and this time she saw no fellow novice. She saw a challenge, an obstacle, a vessel for her own purification. "Again," Anya croaked, pushing herself to her feet, the welt on her back screaming its hymn of admonition. Abbess Severina gave a single, slow nod. The lesson was not over, but it had been learned. The whip had not broken her, it had remade her. As she retrieved her training knife and faced Katerina once more, Anya's heart was a drum of newfound conviction. Mercy was a luxury for the weak. Faith, true faith, was a weapon that had to be hardened in the fire of absolute ruthlessness, and she would let it burn her until nothing soft remained. The chapel of the final vow was a sepulchre of silence and incense, a long, narrow chamber carved from obsidian so dark it seemed to drink the light from the rows of tall, black candles lining its walls. Their flames did not illuminate, they punctuated the gloom, each a tiny, unwavering star in a void. At the far end, upon a raised dais of bone-white marble, stood the massive, silent form of a suit of power armor, its ceramite plates the color of dried blood, its edges trimmed in silver. A bolter, sleek and deadly, rested against its greave. This was no mere equipment. It was a sarcophagus waiting for a soul, a vessel of wrath awaiting its animating spirit. Anya knelt with her 9 sisters on the cold stone floor, clad only in simple, rough-spun shifts of undyed wool. They had been scrubbed raw in ritual ablutions, their hair shorn to identical, stubbled scalps, their bodies anointed with sacred unguents that smelled of ozone and myrrh. For 3 days and nights they had fasted, prayed, and maintained a silent vigil in their cells, their only sustenance the recitation of the oath of eternal service. Now hollowed out by hunger and filled to bursting with a terrifying, luminous certainty, they were ready. The canoness entered. She was ancient, her face a web of fine lines etched by decades of warfare and devotion, but her back was straight as a power sword, her eyes burning with an inner fire that belied her years. She was attended by 2 veteran sisters superior, their faces stern masks beneath their wimples, and a hooded tech priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus, his mechadendrites twitching with pious anticipation. Progena of the Schola, the canoness's voice rang out, clear and sharp as a bell in the silent chamber. You stand upon the threshold. Behind you lies the life of clay and doubt. Before you lies the life of ceramite and conviction. To cross is to die. To cross is to be reborn, speak the words and be unmade. As one, the 10 women began to recite the oath. Their voices, thin from hunger but fused with iron purpose, filled the chapel. The words were not new to Anya. She had whispered them in the dark of the Schola, shouted them in the drill yards of the convent. But now, in this sacred silence, they took on a new, terrifying weight. They were not a promise, they were a self-annihilation. I renounce my past, for it is ash before his glory, she thought of the orphanage's cold, the tattered image now surrendered to the convent's reliquary. Ashes. I renounce my future, for it is his to spend. She relinquished all dreams, all fear of tomorrow, offering the blank slate of her days to a divine will she could not comprehend. I renounce my will, for it is a flawed and feeble thing. This was the core of it, the surrender of choice, of desire, of self. The moment the words left her lips, she felt a profound, vertiginous emptiness as if her soul had been scooped out. Then into that void rushed a torrent of purpose so vast it threatened to shatter her. She was no longer Anya. She was a vessel, an instrument. The canoness approached, bearing a brazier of glowing coals upon which rested the brand, a rod of silvered steel tipped with the intricate double-headed form of the imperial aquila. It glowed with a heat that warped the air around it. "Receive the mark of ownership," the canoness intoned. "Let it sear away the final dregs of the individual. Let it scar the flesh so the soul may remember its master." Anya did not hesitate. She leaned forward, presenting the bare skin of her right shoulder. The tech priest's mechadendrites steadied her with a cold, metallic grip. There was no pain at first, only immense pressure. Then the smell came, the sweet, acrid, unmistakable scent of her own flesh cooking. The pain followed, a white-hot sun blooming beneath her skin, etching the shape of the aquila into muscle and bone. She did not cry out. She embraced it, channeling the agony into the final line of the oath, her voice rising clear and strong through clenched teeth. "I am the hammer, I am the blade, I am the fire of his wrath and the shield of his faithful, until my final breath and beyond." As the brand was lifted, the pain did not recede, it transmuted. It became a constant, thrumming presence, a live wire of devotion fused to her body. The canoness nodded, a flicker of something akin to approval in her ancient eyes. The sisters superior moved forward. With ritual solemnity they stripped away the rough shifts. Then they began to clad the novices in the sacred armor. Each piece was heavy, cold, and impossibly complex. Ceramite plates, plasteel underlayers, fiber bundle musculature. As the chest plate was locked into place over her throbbing brand, Anya felt its weight settle not just on her shoulders but on her soul. It was a coffin and a cradle. The helmet, lowered over her head, sealed her in a world of filtered air, muted sound, and the soft green glow of the retinal display. The world outside became data. The living, breathing chapel became a tactical readout. Finally, the bolter was placed in her hands. It was heavier than any training weapon, its weight solid, demanding, perfect. Its surface was cool, but as her fingers closed around the grip, she felt a pulse, as if the machine spirit within had recognized its new bearer. A final anointing, sacred oils, burning like ice and fire on her skin, was applied to the joints of her armor. Sealed within the tomb of her new identity, Anya's senses turned inward. The silence of the helmet was absolute. The pain of the brand, the chill of the oil, the weight of the armor, they coalesced. Behind her closed eyes, visions erupted, not of her own making, but fed by a lifetime of doctrine and desperate hope. She saw a battlefield under a hellish sky, her bolter roaring in her hands, heretics falling before her like wheat before the scythe. She saw herself standing before a tide of gibbering horrors, a lone flame in the darkness, her faith a tangible light holding back the warp. She saw the ultimate vision, the secret yearning buried beneath layers of fear, martyrdom. A glorious final stand, her lifeblood watering the soil of a liberated world, her name etched on a roll of honor, her soul ascending to the Emperor's side. In the vision there was no pain, only a profound, all-consuming peace. The vision shattered, leaving her back in the silent, armored dark, but the echo remained. A final, silent vow crystallized in her heart, harder than ceramite, brighter than any battlefield flame. She would become worthy, not of the armor, not of the weapon, but of the vision. She would hone herself into the perfect instrument, relentless, precise, and utterly without mercy or doubt. She would become the hammer, the blade, the fire. She would pray with every bolt fired, every heretic purged, every step taken towards her own glorious end. The canoness's voice crackled in her helm's vox bead, a whisper from the world outside the tomb. "Rise, sisters, rise and serve." With a hiss of equalizing pressure, Sister Anya of the Order of the Ebon Chalice stood. The instrument was forged. The oath was sealed in fire and flesh. All that remained was to be used. The Stormbirds. Hold was a cathedral of roaring noise and shuddering violence, a metal womb vibrating with the promise of a bloody birth. Sister Anya sat strapped into her restraint harness, the cold ceramite of her power armor pressed against the fuselage's vibrating frame. Around her, the 9 other sisters of her squad were dark, silent statues, their faces hidden behind the impassive masks of their helmets, their only movement the methodical, ritualized checking and rechecking of their war gear. The act was a prayer in itself. Anya's gauntleted hands moved over the familiar contours of her bolter, clearing the chamber, verifying the magazine's load, tracing the sacred inscriptions etched along its barrel. Each touch was a reaffirmation. Each click and snap of components was a bead on the rosary of war. Her internal chrono marked the time until planetfall. 15 minutes. The fear arrived then, not as a sudden shock, but as a cold, visceral presence that uncoiled in her gut. It was different from the anxiety of the sparring cage or the dread of the abbess's whip. This was primal. It smelled of ozone, promethium, and the coppery scent of void-sealed air. It sounded like the deafening scream of the engines and the thrum of her own pulse in her ears. She could feel it in the vibration coming up through the deck plates, a tremor that spoke of atmospheric entry and the waiting fire below. This was the fear of the abyss, the terror of the drop into the unknown maelstrom where all her training would be tested not against simulations, but against the raw, screaming hatred of the heretic. She closed her eyes behind her visor. The litany of preparedness formed on her lips, her voice a whisper lost in the engine's roar, yet amplified to clarity within the sanctum of her helm. My armor is contempt, my shield is disgust, my sword is hatred. In the Emperor's name let none survive. The words were a ward, a psychic rampart built against the fear. As she recited them, she felt the cold dread begin to transmute, its energy siphoned into the furnace of her zeal. The fear was not banished, it was consecrated. It became the fuel for the hatred the litany demanded. The heretics waiting below were no longer abstract concepts. They were the source of this trembling in her hands, this tightness in her chest. They had earned her disgust. They would meet her contempt. A violent lurch shook the craft, throwing her against her restraints. The lumiglobes in the hold flickered, casting strobing shadows. The Voxnet crackled to life with the strained, calm voice of the pilot servitor. Atmospheric penetration, enemy anti-air fire, brace. Chaoses was too mild a word for the descent that followed. It was as if the Stormbird had been swallowed by a raging metal giant that was trying to chew it apart. Concussive whumps of nearby detonations hammered the hull. Shrapnel screeched against the outer plates like the claws of a vast beast. The craft banked violently, then dropped in a stomach-lurching dive. The gravity compensators groaned, failing for a second, and Anya's body was crushed down into the seat with crushing force. Warning runes flashed crimson on her retinal display, portside engines compromised, hull integrity failing in sections. The screams of the dying world outside were nothing compared to the deafening orchestra of destruction playing against the fuselage. Through the Vox, she heard the steady, chanting voices of her squad sisters, their prayers weaving together into a single thread of faith holding against the tumult. Sister Superior Helena's voice cut through, sharp as a knife. "Stand ready. Emperor sees our devotion. He prepares our landing zone." Another direct hit. The world became a blinding flash of orange, and a sound so immense it was a pure, silent pressure before the audio pixceptors recalibrated to the ringing aftermath. A gout of flame and smoke erupted from a ruptured conduit near the rear ramp, quickly smothered by automated systems. The acrid stink of burning wiring and promethium filled the recycled air. Then a different sound. A deep hydraulic groan felt more than heard. The ramp at the rear of the hold began to lower, revealing not the black of the void but a swirling, hellish panorama of ochre smoke, flashes of weapon fire, and the jagged, towering silhouettes of Hive City spires. The wind howled in, a gale thick with the smells of burning plasteel, rot, and cordite. "Go, go, for the Emperor and the Ebon Chalice." Sister Superior Helena's command was a roar. Restraints disengaged with a hiss. Anya was moving before the thought fully formed, her body acting on years of drilled response. She rose, her armor's weight now a familiar and comforting burden. With her squad, she formed a line and advanced toward the yawning, chaotic maw of the ramp. The transition from the relative sanctuary of the hold to the Hive World Street was a descent into a different realm of sensation. The noise was no longer contained. It exploded around her, the staccato bark of auto-guns, the deeper thump of mortars, the screams, both human and inhuman, that wove through the din like threads of pure agony. The smoke was a physical thing, choking and particulate, reducing visibility to a shifting landscape of grim shadows and sudden, terrifying flashes. Her boots hit the ground, not earth, but a slurry of ash, rubble, and things she did not care to identify. The Stormbird, its engine screaming in protest, was already lifting off behind them, leaving the 10 sisters in a loose, professional perimeter amidst the ruins of a once grand boulevard. Shattered statues of imperial saints lay in pieces. The facades of hab blocks were pockmarked with shell holes, their windows like blind black eyes. Fires burned in piles of debris, casting a flickering, malevolent light. And the screams, they were everywhere. Not just cries of pain, but shrieks of fervent, insane rage, chants to dark powers that twisted the air. They came from the mouths of figures emerging from the smoke, ragged, wild-eyed men and women clad in scavenged flak plate and daubed with blasphemous sigils in what looked like blood. Their weapons were crude, but their eyes held a fervor to match her own, a dark mirror of zealotry. Sister Superior Helena's icon flashed on her display. The order was simple: A targeting rune painted a cluster of heretics taking cover behind a burned-out chimera. The vox crackled with a single word: purge. Anya raised her bolter, the weight solid and sure in her hands. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, focused clarity and a rising, righteous fury that burned with the heat of a newborn star. The street was choked with smoke and screams. She took her first step forward into the fire. The world narrowed to the length of her bolter's barrel, to the heaving, screaming forms emerging from the ochre haze. Her targeting reticule, a crisp green cross in her visor, settled on the chest of a man scrambling. Over the hull of the ruined chimera. He was gaunt, his face a mask of soot and fervent hatred, a rusted autogun clutched in his hands. He saw her, his mouth opening in a snarl or a prayer, she could not tell, and it did not matter. He was a flaw in the design, a correction to be made. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The bolter kicked against her pauldron, a solid, satisfying punch of contained violence. The report was a deafening crump that echoed in the tight street, momentarily drowning the cacophony. She saw the mass-reactive round strike true, a flash of impact on the scavenged flak plate. There was a microsecond of resistance, then the delayed charge within the shell detonated. The man did not simply fall. He came apart in a mist of red and a burst of fragmented armor. One moment he was a living, hate-filled entity. The next, he was a ruined sculpture of meat and bone, collapsing in a wet heap behind the chimera's treads. The visceral reality of it, the sudden, absolute cessation, the spray that pattered against the rusted metal, hammered into Anya's consciousness with a force no simulation could ever replicate. This was not a training servitor deactivating. This was a life, however wretched, extinguished by her will, by her faith, by the weapon in her hands. A cold, hollow shock bloomed in her chest, a silent scream of horror at the terrible simplicity of it all. The shock had no time to take root. Movement to her left. Sister Mara, her squad's designated close assault specialist, was a whirlwind of polished ceramite and a roaring chainsword, driving into a knot of heretics who had rushed from a shattered storefront. Mara's form was perfect, her strikes economical and brutal, the teeth of her sword chewing through flesh and crude armor. Then, a shape detached from the shadows of a doorway, a lithe, silent figure clad in dark, quilted fabrics, not the ragged zealot's gear of the others. It moved with an unnatural grace, slipping under Mara's guard as she engaged a second foe. Anya's warning died in her throat, unvoiced. The blade was a sliver of dull metal. It flashed once, a precise, almost surgical motion across the seal between Mara's helmet and gorget. There was no dramatic spray, just a sudden, awful cessation of movement from Mara. Her chainsword's roar sputtered and died. She took one stumbling step forward, then dropped to her knees, a faint, liquid gurgle the only sound from her vox before it cut to static. The dark-clad figure melted back into the smoke, gone. Mara's body slumped to the ground, a mere pile of armor now. The horror that had been a cold seed moments before erupted into a freezing torrent inside Anya. It was Mara who had shared the gruel in the refectory, who had chanted beside her during the endless vigils, whose shoulder had borne the same searing brand. Gone. Not in a blaze of glory, but butchered in a filthy street, her death as swift and ignoble as that of the heretic Anya had just slain. The universe seemed to tilt, the righteous fury guttering like a candle in a gale. What was the point? What was the glorious design in this squalid, anonymous meat grinder? Then it erupted, not from the enemy but from her own helm's vox speed. It was Sister Superior Helena's voice, but it was transformed, amplified, and woven with the voices of the entire squad, a cascade of sacred sound that blasted through the channel at maximum volume. It was the battle hymn of the Ebon Chalice, a thunderous, discordant, and utterly magnificent chorus of pipe organ simulators, grinding war horns, and the fervent, screaming prayers of the sisters. It was faith made audible, a wall of sonic fury that drowned out the screams of the heretics, the roar of the fires, and the silent scream of Anya's own doubt. The hymn was a psychic slap, a spiritual defibrillator. It did not comfort, it commanded. It filled the hollow shock with molten zeal, burned away the freezing horror with its incendiary rhythm. The sight of Mara's body did not change, but its meaning was reforged in the instant. It was not a tragedy, it was a testament, a verse in the hymn. Mara had not been slaughtered, she had offered her blood to the song. Her death was a note in the Emperor's symphony of wrath. Anya's lips moved behind her visor. The words were instinctual, rising from a well deeper than fear or grief. The Emperor protects. It was not a plea. It was a declaration of fact, as solid as the ceramite on her skin. He protected not by shielding them from harm, but by making their suffering and their deaths meaningful. He protected by giving them this hymn, this fury, this purpose. She advanced. Her boots crunched on rubble and worse. Autogun rounds fired from windows and barricades found her. They sparked against her armor, tiny, impotent sunbursts of impact on the blood-red ceramite. Each spark was a punctuation mark in the hymn. Each ping and ricochet was a percussion to her chanting. She did not feel the impacts. Only the vibration, a tactile affirmation of her inviolability. Her faith was her shield, and it was holding. She moved with a new rhythm, the rhythm of the hymn in her ears and the litany on her lips. Her bolter spoke again and again. Each kick was a beat. Each heretic that fell was a resolved chord. She saw them not as people, not even as vessels of heresy anymore, but as obstacles to the forward momentum of the song. She cleared a corner, firing from the hip, the mass-reactive shells turning a barricade of rubble and zealots into a geyser of debris and viscera. She stepped over the remains, her chant unwavering. The squad was a single organism now, driven by the shared pulse of the hymn. They flowed down the street, a tide of crimson and silver, their bolters flashing in the smoky gloom. Anya was no longer thinking, no longer feeling in any human sense. She was a vessel, as she had vowed to be. The instrument, forged in the convent and anointed in the Stormbird, was finally being played upon the flesh of the enemy, and the music was glorious, terrible, and absolute. She advanced, sparks dancing on her armor like saintly fire, the words a ceaseless mantra in the heart of the storm. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. The silence after the hymn was a physical presence, thick and heavy, pressing down on the rubble-choked street. The last echoes of bolter fire had faded, replaced by the crackle of promethium-fed fires and the low, agonized moans of the dying. Heretics whose bodies had not yet received the Emperor's final mercy. The squad stood in a loose perimeter, their armor streaked with soot and other, darker substances. The battle hymn had ceased in their vox beads, leaving a ringing void in its wake, filled only by the labored sound of their own breathing filtered through their helms. Sister Superior Helena's voice cut through the quiet, stripped of its hymnal fury, now flat and functional. Secure the area, collect our fallen. The Emperor's work here is done. Now we perform our duty to our sisters. The duty was grim, methodical. Anya moved with the others, her movements automatic. They located the bodies. 3 sisters, including Mara. They had fallen at different points along the street, their crimson armor now dulled by dust and gore. Anya approached Mara's form. The dark-clad assassin was long gone, vanished into the hive's endless bowels. Mara lay as she had fallen, curled slightly on her side. The killing wound was a neat, terrible line at her throat. The ceramic gorget scored deep and the flexible undersuit beneath sliced open. Very little blood showed. It had mostly pooled inside her armor. With another sister, Anya lifted the body. It was unnervingly heavy, the powered armor inert and lifeless, a shell. They carried Mara and the others back to a cleared plaza where a rhino transport, its hull scarred from the fighting, now waited, its rear ramp lowered. The bodies were laid side by side on the cold metal deck with a reverence that was entirely separate from tenderness. It was the reverence owed to a sacred relic, to a vessel that had contained a holy flame now passed to the Emperor's side. Back at the fortified outpost, a makeshift shrine had been established in a vaulted sub-hall of a looted administratum building. The bodies were brought there, placed upon biers of empty munitions crates draped with black cloth. The squad removed their helmets. The air was cold and smelled of damp rockcrete and incense. Anya's face felt naked, the chill touching skin that had known only the filtered environment of her helm for hours. Her eyes were drawn to the three still forms. Canoness Laura, who had arrived with reinforcements, presided over the martyr's rite. She was older than Abbess Severina, her face a topographical map of a lifetime of warfare, but her eyes burned with an undimmed fire. She stood before the biers, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the stone chamber. With the weight of absolute conviction. "Behold the currency of our faith," she began, her gaze sweeping over the living and the dead. These sisters did not fall, they ascended. They heard the Emperor's call, and with joyous hearts they paid the price he demanded. Their blood is not a stain upon this world. It is a seal, a sanctification of this ground, bought and purified by their ultimate sacrifice. In their dying, they achieved the pinnacle of our existence. They have joined the eternal choir at his side, where their voices now swell the anthems of the divine. Envy them, sisters, for they have completed the journey we all march. They have traded transient duty for eternal glory. The words were a familiar liturgy, but hearing them over Mara's body lent them a terrifying, magnetic power. The canoness spoke of joy, of completion, of a reward so sublime it made the horrors of the street seem a trivial price. The gathered sisters responded with fervent amens, their faces alight with zealous certainty. The doubt Anya had felt on the street, the hollow shock of that first kill, seemed like a pathetic, whispered heresy in the face of this roaring consensus. After the rite came the private preparation. Anya was assigned to Mara. A basin of warmed, scented water and clean linens were brought. Alone with the body, Anya began the solemn task of washing the armor, of cleaning the mortal vessel for its final journey to the convent's ossuary. She worked in silence, her movements gentle but efficient. She wiped away the grime from the blood-red ceramite, revealing the gleaming silver of the fleur-de-lis. She carefully cleaned around the fatal wound. As she worked, she finally allowed herself to look at Mara's face. The helmet had been removed. Mara's features were pale, waxy in the low light, but there was an expression there that arrested Anya's hands. It was not pain nor fear. It was peace, a profound, empty serenity. The fierce intensity that had always animated Mara. The sparring cages in prayer was gone, smoothed away into a calm so absolute it was unsettling. Was this the glory the canoness spoke of? Was this the joyous heart with which she had met her end? A treacherous thought wormed its way through Anya's devotion. Did she feel anything at all, or did the darkness just take her? The canoness promised an eternal choir, a conscious, glorious afterlife. But the face before her spoke only of silence, of an end. Was martyrdom truly a reward, or was it simply the final, logical exhaustion of a life spent as an instrument? The question was a shard of ice in her chest. From the main hall, the sound of the sisters singing the canticle of the fallen began to swell. It was a slower, more mournful hymn than the battle hymn, but it built in power, layer upon layer of harmony, a tidal wave of collective faith that flooded the side chamber where Anya worked. The fervent voices, the unwavering certainty in the lyrics that praised the martyrs blessed. Release crashed over her solitary doubt. The serene emptiness of Mara's face was reinterpreted by the song. It became evidence of divine peace, not simple oblivion. The shard of ice melted, dissolved in the heat of that shared, roaring conviction. By the time she finished her task, Mara's armor gleamed, and her face seemed almost to glow in the candlelight, a saintly visage. Anya's moment of questioning was gone, buried under the weight of ceremony and the seductive, unifying power of the shared belief. The canoness was right. To question the glory of the sacrifice was to insult the sacrifice itself. It was to betray Mara and the emperor she had died for. Anya rose, her own face now a mask of restored conviction. She bowed her head to the body not in grief but in homage. The blood of martyrs was the seed of the Imperium. Mara's death was not a waste. It was an investment in the eternal war, a down payment on victory. And Anya's duty was to ensure the investment paid dividends. Heretics purged and worlds reclaimed. She would use her own life and, when the time came, her own death as currency in the same divine economy. The doubt had been a weakness, a final echo of the orphan's fear. She let the hymn carry it away. As she rejoined her sisters in the main hall, her voice rose with theirs, strong and clear, extolling the glory of the fallen, reinforcing the only truth that mattered. In the Imperium, sacrifice was not tragedy. It was the highest honor. The underhive was not a place. It was a digestive tract. The squad descended through access shafts and rust-eaten service tunnels, leaving behind the relative order of the midhive for a realm of perpetual gloom and biological decay. The air grew thick and warm, saturated with the stench of stagnant water, fungal rot, and the pervasive, sweet-sour odor of unwashed humanity pushed beyond its limits. Lumiglobes were rare here, replaced by flickering chemical flames or patches of phosphorescent lichen that painted. The dripping rockcrete walls in ghastly shades of green and yellow. The sounds of the hive above, the distant rumble of machinery, the faint echoes of industry, faded away, swallowed by the all-consuming drip of water, the skittering of unseen things, and a deep, resonant silence that felt like the held breath of a dying beast. Their mission was a purge. Intelligence spoke of a mutant enclave coalescing around a defunct sump pump station, a blasphemous mockery of community festering in the dark. Heresy was not just a matter of wrong belief here. It was written in twisted flesh, a visible physical corruption that demanded the flame. They found the enclave in a vast, cathedral-like chamber that had once housed titanic pumping machinery. The machinery was silent now, great iron skeletons festooned with crude shanties made of scrap metal, rat hide, and fungal growth. And there were the mutants. The reports had not prepared her. They were not the glorious, monstrous abominations of sanctioned pictorials, all claws and rage. They were pitiable, wretched, a gallery of suffering etched in malformed flesh. A woman with a second vestigial head weeping from her shoulder, its tiny mouth mewling soundlessly. A man whose arms had fused into a single, clumsy flipper, which he used to shuffle a collection of rusted trinkets. Children, Emperor forgive her, children, with skin like fish scale or eyes that clustered like grapes. They moved in a shambling, lethargic mass, their forms illuminated by the squad's helmet lamps, which cut through the fungal gloom like the gaze of angry gods. Sister Superior Helena's order was a flat, static crackle in the vox. Cleanse it. Leave no taint. The Emperor's peace for these abominations is fire. Anya hefted her flamer, the promethium tank heavy on her back, the igniter pilot light a tiny, hungry blue eye at the weapon's muzzle. She was the chosen instrument of this particular mercy. She stepped forward, the hiss of her armor's servos, scattering a group of cowering, multi-limbed things. The first gout of flame was a roaring, liquid sun that erupted from her weapon, painting the chamber in stark, hellish relief. It engulfed a cluster of huts and the shapes within. The sound was not the clean crump of a bolter. It was a great, hungry whoosh, followed by a chorus of shrieks that were horrifyingly human in their pitch of agony. Figures became living torches, stumbling, flailing, their forms blackening and collapsing. The smell was atrocious, burning promethium, charring flesh, and the underlying stench of the pit. Their cries echoed in the vast space, a high, desperate ululation that seemed to cling to the dripping walls long after the flames had consumed the voices that made them. Anya advanced, a bringer of purifying hell. She painted fire across shanties, across piles of refuse, across the twisted, scrambling forms. Each burst was an act of faith, a correction of the gross anatomical heresies before her. Yet with each scream that was cut short, a cold, sharp stone settled deeper in her gut. This was not battle. This was extermination. The hatred she had channeled against the armed heretic in the streets above had no purchase here. These creatures cowered. They hid. They died without raising a weapon, only voices in a final, terrible plea to a universe that had already discarded them. Then her lamp caught a figure standing apart, near the base of a great dead gear. It was taller than the others, its form less chaotic. It wore tattered but recognizably human clothing, the remnants of a hive worker's coveralls. Its face, turned toward the light, was almost normal. One side was handsome, even with a strong jaw and clear eye. The other side was a melted landscape of waxy, scarred flesh, the eye a milky orb, the ear a misshapen lump. It held up its hands, one five-fingered and human, the other a fused, three-digited claw. Its mouth, the good side, worked. A sound emerged, not a guttural howl, but a strained, desperate whisper that carried through the hiss of the flames and the distant screams. "Please, I served the forge, I was faithful." The words, coherent and laden with a lifetime of pain and memory, struck Anya like a physical blow. This was no beast. This was a man, or the ghost of one, a soul trapped in a prison of corrupted flesh. The flamer in her hands felt suddenly obscenely heavy, its pilot light a mocking star. The canoness's words from the martyr's right echoed, but they twisted. The Emperor's peace is fire. Was this peace? Was this mercy? The mutant took a half-step forward, its human eye fixed on her, brimming with a terrible, intelligent understanding of its fate. It did not attack, it pleaded. For one heartbeat, too, Anya hesitated. The cold stone of pity lodged in her throat. She saw not a mutant, but a victim, of hive toxins, of genetic misfortune, of the Imperium's uncaring machinery. The flamer's muzzle dipped a fraction of an inch. Then the moment passed. Faith, hardened by the whip and the hymn, reasserted itself with the force of a hydraulic press. Compassion was the poison, doubt was the seed. This creature, however pitiable, was impure. Its very existence was a blasphemy against the human form, a walking insult to the God Emperor's design. Its plea was a trick, a last gasp of the corruption trying to preserve itself. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The jet of promethium was a lance of judgment, enveloping the figure. The whisper became a short, sharp scream, then silence. The almost human form collapsed into a blackened, smoldering shape beside the giant gear. The rest of the purge was a blur, a mechanical execution of duty. When the chamber was silent, save for the crackle of dying fires and the drip of water, the squad regrouped. The air was a choking soup of smoke and cooked meat. No one spoke. Back in the austere, clean silence of the forward command post, the smell of the underhive seemed to have seeped into Anya's very armor. It was in her nostrils, a phantom stench of burning that no ritual ablution could yet erase. But a deeper contamination festered within. The memory of the almost human mutant's face, its plea, the intelligence in its single good eye, these would not yield to prayer. She found Sister Superior Helena in a small, cell-like chamber that served as her office, reviewing tactical data slates. Helena had removed her helmet. Her face was sharp, severe, etched with the same lines of unwavering certainty as the convent statues. Anya stood at attention before the bare metal desk, her own helmet cradled in the crook of her arm. "Superior," Anya began, her voice tighter than she intended. Helena looked up, her gaze assessing. "Report, sister." The enclave is purified, no sign of coordinated resistance. The taint is burned away. A clean execution of duty. The Emperor is pleased. The words, meant to affirm, felt like an accusation. The cold stone of pity turned, becoming a sharp shard that demanded to be expelled. Superior, during the cleansing, one of the mutants, it spoke, it pleaded for mercy. Helena's expression did not change, but a deeper stillness settled over her. She set the data slate down, and I felt a moment of pity before I purified it. The confession was a whisper, a heresy given voice in the sterile room. For a long moment, Helena said nothing. The only sound was the distant hum of the command post generators. Then she rose, circling the desk to stand before Anya. Her eyes were like chips of flint. Compassion for the impure is not a virtue, Sister Anya. It is a heresy, a crack in the armor of your faith through which corruption, real spiritual corruption, can seep. Her voice was low, devoid of anger, but utterly merciless. That thing that spoke to you was not a man. It was a shell, a vessel for the rot that twists the galaxy. Its words were not a plea, they were a weapon. A psychic hook cast to snag the weak of spirit, to make you hesitate, to make you question. The moment you entertain the idea that such a creature deserves pity, you begin the slide into seeing its existence as tolerable. And from tolerance to acceptance, from acceptance to collaboration, the path is short and steep. Anya felt the words like the lash of Abbess Severina, but this cut deeper, striking at the soul rather than the flesh. I did not hesitate in my duty, she insisted, though the statement felt hollow. But you hesitated here. Helena tapped a ceramite-clad finger against Anya's temple. You allowed the illusion of its suffering to make you suffer. You took its burden upon yourself. That is not strength. That is vanity. You presume your empathy is more holy than the Emperor's judgment. He, in his infinite wisdom, has declared the mutant anathema. Our role is not to understand, but to obey, to cleanse. Your pity is a prideful echo of the individual will you swore to renounce. The shard of doubt was being excised, not with solace but with searing logic. Helena's words reframed the entire moment. The mutant's intelligence was not a tragedy. It was a sharper, more dangerous form of corruption. Her pity was not a spark of humanity, but a flaw in her spiritual armor, a failure of her programming as an instrument. The feeling is a relic, Helena continued, her tone softening only a degree into something akin to a surgeon's precision. A fragment of the soft, civilian soul you once were. You must burn it out. See the mutant for what it truly is, a fault line in reality, a scream of wrongness given flesh. Your flamer does not bring pain, it brings silence to that scream. It is an act of cosmic hygiene, nothing more, nothing less. Anya stood straighter, the weight of the rebuke forging a new resolve. The haunting face in the fire began to blur, its features dissolving into the abstract concept of taint, its plea fading into the generic chatter of the impure. She had mistaken a spiritual attack for a moment of more complexity. I understand, Superior, Anya said, her voice firm now. The moment of weakness will be purged in prayer and penance. Helena gave a single, slow nod. See that it is. The enemy we fight is cunning. It will attack not just your body, but your compassion, your grief, your doubt. These are the back doors to your soul. Seal them with faith. Let nothing but the Emperor's hatred dwell within you. For if you pity the mutant today, what will you do tomorrow when the demon whispers, wearing the face of a fallen sister? The question hung in the air, a chilling prophecy. Anya bowed her head, the lesson seared into her as deeply as the brand on her shoulder. She had confessed a heresy, and in return received not forgiveness, but a warning and a weapon. The absolute, dehumanizing clarity of true fanaticism. As she left the chamber to seek out the vigil chapel, the mutant's cry was already fading, replaced by the colder, steadier mantra. Compassion is the poison. Pity is the heresy. The flame is peace. She would repeat it until the memory burned away, and only the pure, unsullied hatred remained. The shrine had been dedicated to Saint Arabella the Unflinching, a minor patron of hive gangers who died defending a water purification plant from Xeno's raiders. It was a humble place, a small ferrocrete alcove set into a soot-stained hab-block wall, now defiled beyond recognition. The sisters arrived at dusk, the last bloody light of the hive's smog-choked sun painting the scene in tones of rust and dried viscera. The statue of the saint was gone, smashed to gravel. In its place, a symbol had been carved directly into the wall with something that had burned and melted the rockcrete. It was an eight-armed star, its lines jagged and hateful, and from its deep grooves, a thick, rust-colored fluid seeped in a slow, viscous bleed. It was not paint. It smelled of oxidized metal and something else, something sweetly rotten that clawed at the back of the throat. The air around. The shrine was several degrees colder than the surrounding street, a pocket of winter in the hive's perpetual fever. A profound silence hung over it, a vacuum that seemed to suck the distant sounds of the underhive away, leaving only the oppressive weight of wrongness. Anya's rosarius, the sacred pendant that hung from her belt, grew warm against her thigh. At first, it was a gentle heat, like a stone left in sunlight. Then it intensified, becoming a distinct, pulsing warmth that throbbed in time with her heartbeat. She recognized the sensation from doctrinal lessons, a ward reacting to the presence of the immaterial. It was a comfort, a tiny star of faith anchored to her body, but its warmth felt fragile against the creeping cold emanating from the defiled wall. That cold was not merely physical. It carried a psychic residue, a creeping despair that slithered past the ears and into the mind. It was the feeling of hope curdling, of meaning leaching away, leaving only a hollow, weary certainty that all struggle was futile, all faith a childish delusion. Anya felt it as a whisper at the edge of her thoughts, urging her to lay down her bolter, to accept the inevitable decay of all things. She clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around her weapon's grip. The warmth of the rosarius flared, a silent rebuke, pushing back the mental fog. She focused on the hatred, the clean, burning anger at this violation. The despair recoiled, but it did not vanish. It lingered like a bad smell. Sister Superior Helena motioned with 2 fingers, splitting the squad. They advanced with bolters raised, following the trail of psychic filth that led from the shrine into a nearby access tunnel for a long-defunct atmospheric processor. The tunnel was a throat of darkness, the lumiglobes shattered. Their helmet lamps cut beams through the gloom, illuminating walls slick with unnatural phosphorescent algae that pulsed with a slow, sickly rhythm. The servitor was found in a chamber that had once housed filtration units. It was a standard labor model, or had been, a hulking brute of pale, vat-grown flesh fused to a crude hydraulic frame, its brain a doctrina wafer imprinted with simple obedience protocols. Now, it was an abomination. Its flesh was warping, bubbling as if from an internal heat. Patches of its skin had sloughed away, revealing pulsating musculature that glistened with a film of iridescent slime. Its left arm had split at the elbow, the bones elongating and sharpening into a twisted chitinous blade that scratched mindlessly against the metal floor with a sound like grinding teeth. Its head lolled on a thickening neck, its face a mask of frozen, silent agony, the mouth stretched wide in a soundless scream. From its ocular implants, a faint, pinkish light wept down its cheeks. It was not attacking. It was waiting, or suffering. The air around it vibrated with a subaudible hum that made Anya's teeth ache. The rosarius at her hip was now hot enough to be uncomfortable, a constant, urgent warning. Possessed, Helena's voice was a flat line in the vox, a scrap of warp filth nesting in the machine. Purge it. The thing that had been a servitor turned its weeping eyes toward them as they opened fire. Bolter rounds tore into its distended flesh, punching fist-sized craters that oozed thick, black fluid. It did not scream. It let out a low, grinding moan that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It lurched forward, its bladed arm swinging in a wide, powerful arc. Sister Katerina dodged back, the tip scoring a shriek of sparks from her chest plate. Anya focused her fire on its central mass, the mass-reactive shells detonating deep within its corrupted biology. The thing staggered but came on, driven by a will that was not its own. Its other arm, still a clumsy hydraulic claw, snatched a fallen piece of ductwork and hurled it with terrifying force. Anya ducked, the metal screeching past her helm. Its core, the doctrine wafer, Helena shouted. Sister Evangeline, armed with a meltagun, stepped forward. The weapon coughed once, a brief, searing beam of star-hot energy that connected with the servitor's chest. There was a flash of blinding white, a hiss of vaporizing matter, and the smell of ozone and cooked meat. The possessed machine froze. The pink light in its eyes winked out. The warping flesh seemed to deflate, collapsing in on itself with a wet sigh as the parasitic will was violently exorcised. It slumped to the floor, an inert pile of meat and metal already beginning to cool. The subaudible hum ceased. The chamber was suddenly, profoundly silent, the only sound the cycling of their armor's air filters. The psychic pressure lifted, the creeping despair retreating like a tide, but the cold remained, and something else. As Anya lowered her bolter, the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. The warmth of her Rosarius did not fade, it intensified, becoming a near burn. She turned slowly, her lamp beam piercing. The shadows at the rear of the chamber, where the broken machinery created a nest of deep darkness. There, in the blackest cleft between two dead generators, she felt a gaze. It was not a physical seeing. It was an awareness, a sentient, malignant attention focusing on her with the weight of a collapsing star. It had no eyes, but she felt it see her, not her armor, not her form, but the flickering flame of her soul within its shell of faith. The gaze was infinitely cold, ancient, and hungry. It promised nothing but an end to warmth, to light, to the very concept of self. It was the essence of the despair that had haunted the shrine, given a focal point, a prelude, a tasting. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, Sister Anya of the Ebon Chalice stood frozen, locked in that silent, soul-deep scrutiny. The battle with the possessed servitor had been a physical struggle. This was an ontological assault. The gaze sought not to break her body, but to negate the very principles that gave it purpose, her faith, her hatred, her will to endure. It whispered without words that her Rosarius was a trinket, her prayers empty noise, her emperor a distant, uncaring corpse. Then, as suddenly as it had focused, the attention withdrew. The shadows in the cleft were just shadows again. The crushing weight vanished, leaving a vacuum of sensation that was almost as terrifying. The Rosarius cooled rapidly against her thigh, but the chill in her soul remained. It was a new kind of cold, deeper than the hive's winter, more profound than the fear of death. It was the cold of the void between stars, the cold of a truth too horrific to fully comprehend. They had destroyed a symptom, but the disease, intelligent, patient, and ravenously hungry, was still here. It had looked at her, it had marked her. Anya, Helena's voice in the vox was sharp. Report. Anya took a shuddering breath, the filtered air cold in her lungs. Nothing superior, she said, her voice thankfully steady. Chamber is clear. But it was a lie. As they filed out of the processing chamber, leaving the husk of the servitor behind, Anya knew with a certainty that chilled her more than any gaze that the shadow was not gone. It had simply slunk back into the cracks of the world, waiting. And it had seen something in her it found interesting. The war against heresy had just revealed its true face, and it was a face of infinite demonic hunger. The memory of that gaze would linger, a frost etching her soul, a silent promise that the horror had only just begun. The silence of the vigil chapel was a different beast from the silence after battle. That was a ringing void, an exhaustion of sound. This was a cultivated emptiness, a thick, velvet quiet pressed into the cold stone chamber by centuries of whispered prayer. The only light came from the single, fat candle burning on the plain iron altar beneath a stark ivory aquila. Its flame did not dance. It stood rigid and unwavering, a golden needle. In the dark, Sister Anya knelt on the unyielding stone floor, her power armor removed, clad only in the simple linen shift of a supplicant. The cold seeped through the thin fabric, gnawing at her knees and spine. She had been here for hours, her eyes fixed on the flame, her lips moving in the automatic recitation of the litany of vigilance. But the words were empty shells. The memories had come instead. They rose from the dark corners of her mind, not as thoughts, but as sensations, vivid, brutal, and unbidden. The wet, tearing crump of her first bolter kill, the sudden transformation of a living man into a ruin of meat, the sight of Sister Mara's body slumping, the terrible finality of that silent gurgle on the Vox. But it was the faces from the underhive that swam before her now with the most horrifying clarity. Not the monstrous ones, but the almost human ones. The woman with the weeping second head, its tiny mouth a perfect O of silent anguish. The children with clustered eyes, that reflected her helmet lamp like pools of trapped, terrified light. And him, the mutant with the half-human face, his one good eye holding not hatred but a desperate, intelligent plea. "Please, I served the forge, I was faithful," the words echoed in the sacred silence, a blasphemous counterpoint to the litany on her lips. She had burned him, she had done her duty. Sister Superior Helena's words had been clear, logical, absolute. Compassion was a heresy. The flame was peace. But in the long, cold watch of the vigil, logic bled away, leaving only the raw, unanswerable images. Had his faith, however twisted his form, been less than hers? Did the Emperor in his golden majesty hear that final whispered plea? Or did he only hear the roar of her flamer? The endless slaughter, the street fights, the purges, the burning of twisted things that wept and begged. What was its true meaning? Was it a sacred crusade to purify the galaxy? Or was it merely a vast, grinding engine of extermination, consuming the flawed and the faithful alike in a meaningless cycle of blood and fire? Mara had died for a street that would likely be overrun again in a month. The mutant had been burned in a chamber that would soon be reclaimed by fungal rot and new, desperate life. Where was the lasting victory? Where was the divine purpose in this ephemeral butchery? A tremor started deep within her, a fine vibration that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the tremor of a foundational crack. She tried to clamp down on it, to flood her mind with the battle hymn, with the canoness's words of glorious martyrdom. But the hymn felt distant, a recording. The martyr's peace on Mara's face now seemed less like serenity and more like simple, blank absence. And then in the deepest, most secret chamber of her soul, a chamber she had believed sealed forever by oath and brand, a question formed. It was not voiced, not even fully shaped into words. It was a silent, terrified opening in her faith, and through it seeped a doubt so profound it stole her breath. "Why are you silent?" The thought was an act of treason. It was the orphan's cry in the Schola, magnified 1,000-fold. All her life she had been told he was a constant, guiding presence. His will was manifest in the orders of her superiors, in the texts of the Lectitio, in the very existence of the Imperium. She had felt his presence in the heat of the brand, in the shared fury of the hymn, in the purpose that drove her forward. But here, alone with the memories of the damned and the dead, she felt nothing. Only the cold, the flame, and the echoing screams. Where was the guidance in this moral quagmire? Where was the comfort for the horror etched into her soul? If this was all his will, why did it feel so much like blind, screaming chaos? The guilt that followed was immediate and crushing, a physical weight on her chest that bent her spine. She had doubted. She had questioned. In her heart she had committed the ultimate heresy. She had implied the Emperor's plan was obscure, his presence absent. She was no better than the murmuring cultists in the shadows. The warmth of her faith, which had sustained her through the whip, the drop, the demon's gaze, felt extinguished, leaving only this howling, empty cold. A sob, harsh and ugly, broke from her throat, shattering the curated silence of the chapel. It was a sound of pure despair, the sound of the orphan she had once been, lost and terrified in an uncaring universe. She clapped a hand over her mouth, but the tears came anyway, hot and shameful, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. She was breaking. The instrument was cracking under a strain no drill could simulate. She could not stay here. The sacred flame seemed to accuse her. The silent Aquila judged her. Her doubt was a contamination in this holy place. With a clumsy, graceless movement, she pushed herself to her feet, her knees screaming in protest. She had to confess. She had to expunge this poison before. It consumed her utterly, before she became a vessel not for the Emperor's wrath, but for the enemy's whispers. Shivering violently, now more from spiritual terror than physical cold, she stumbled from the chapel into the dimly lit stone corridor. Her bare feet were silent on the flags. She knew where she had to go. Confessor Durand, the squad's spiritual confessor, maintained a cell near the barracks. He was a grim, ancient man who smelled of incense and parchment, his eyes clouded but seeing too much. Trembling with the weight of her treasonous thoughts, a soul teetering on the brink of a heresy she could not name, Sister Anya made her way through the sleeping convent. She was not going for absolution, for she felt none was possible. She was going to surrender, to lay the crushing, unbearable weight of her doubt at the feet of the Emperor's appointed intermediary, and pray that whatever came next, penance, punishment, even execution, would be a cleaner pain than this terrifying, silent freefall into the void. Confessor Durand's cell was a pocket of profound austerity, a windowless cube of stone containing only a kneeling bench, a small iron table holding a stub of candle and a simple Aquila pendant, and the confessor himself. He sat on a low stool, a silhouette carved from old leather and bone, draped in the plain black robe of his office. His hands, resting on his knees, were a map of raised veins and old scars. He did not look up as Anya entered, but the air in the room shifted, growing heavier, as if her doubt had a physical mass that displaced the sanctity. She fell to her knees before him, not in reverence, but because her legs would no longer hold her. The words spilled out in a choked, broken torrent, not a formal confession, but a hemorrhage of guilt and terror. She spoke of the mutant's face, of the hollow silence where divine reassurance should have been, of the treasonous question that had fissured her soul. Why are you silent? She did not speak of the demon's gaze in the shadows. That horror felt too vast, too intimate to give voice. This was about the failure within. When she finished, her forehead pressed against the cold stone floor, she was empty, a vessel drained of everything, even despair. For a long moment the only sound was the faint, ragged pull of her own breath. Then Confessor Durand spoke. His voice was dry, like pages turning in a tomb, devoid of judgment but also of comfort. "Doubt is not heresy, child," he said, the words falling like stones. "It is the kindling. Heresy is to nurse it, to let it grow warm in the bosom of your soul. You have brought it into the light. That is the first and only wise thing you have done." He rose slowly, his joints emitting soft clicks. From a hook on the wall, he took an object and laid it on the iron table before her. It was a disciplina, a tool of penance. 9 tails of braided leather, each tipped not with barbs but with smooth, heavy knots of polished darkwood. It was a simpler, purer instrument than the abbess's electrolash, meant not to correct technique but to scour the spirit. "Your penance is one of recalibration," Durand intoned. "The senses have been clouded by pity, which is sentiment, and by despair, which is pride. You have demanded answers where only faith is required. You have sought a voice where His will is written in action. You will go to the chapel. You will kneel before the altar." and you will flagellate yourself until the flesh is silent and the spirit can hear again. You will offer your confusion as pain. You will burn your questions as fuel. When the blood flows, let it carry the doubt away." Anya lifted her head. There was no alternative. This was the mercy of the Imperium, a path, however brutal, back to purity. She took the disciplina, its leather grip cool in her hand. The knots felt obscenely heavy. The chapel was empty, the single candle flame still standing sentinel in the dark. She stripped off her shift, the cold air biting at her skin, raising goose flesh. The brand on her shoulder, the fleur-de-lis on her forehead, seemed to pulse with a memory of sacred fire. She knelt on the stone, her back to the altar, facing the empty nave. She raised the tails. The first strike was tentative, a testing arc. The knots landed across her shoulder blades with a solid, meaty thump. The pain was deep, a blunt shock that reverberated through bone. It was not the sharp, clarifying cut of a blade, but a profound, bruising ache. She gasped, the sound loud in the silence. The second strike was harder, driven by a surge of self-loathing. "Why are you silent?" The knots answered, a wordless physical negation. The pain bloomed hotter this time, spreading across her back like a stain. Then she began in earnest. She fell into a rhythm, each upward arc a renunciation, each downward fall an answer. She offered the mutant's pleading eye to the lash. The memory shattered under the impact, dissolving into a burst of pure sensation. She offered Mara's peaceful, empty face. The knots turned it into a vibration in her teeth. She offered the demon's chilling gaze from the shadows. The pain met it, a fire against the cold. She offered her own treacherous, whispering doubt. The disciplina scourged it, each strike shouting it down with brutal physical truth. The world dissolved into a haze of agony. Time lost meaning. There was only the arc, the impact, the blooming flower of fire on her back, and the next arc. Her skin broke. She felt the wet, warm trickle of blood tracing paths down her ribs, her spine. The smell of it, copper and salt, mixed with the scent of candle wax and cold stone. Her breath came in ragged sobs, but they were not cries of grief anymore. They were the bellows for the forge within her. Each gasp fed the fire of the pain, and the pain burned away everything that was not essential. She lost count of the strokes. Her arm moved with a will of its own, a piston of atonement. The initial sharp pains had merged into a single, roaring conflagration that consumed her entire back. She was floating in it, a mote of consciousness suspended in a sun of suffering. The cold of the chapel was gone. The memories were ash. The questions were smoke. And in that ash, in that smoke, something else began to stir. It started as a warmth that had nothing to do with the fever of torn flesh. It began in the center of her chest, where the icy knot of doubt had resided. A tiny, golden point of light, perceived not with her eyes but with her soul. As the lash fell again, the light did not flinch, it grew. Through the crimson haze of agony, a vision unfolded, not of a face, not of a voice. It was a sensation of immensity, of a presence so vast it encompassed the chapel, the hive world, the galaxy. It was a silent, boundless attention, like the focused gravity of a star. It held no words of comfort, no explanations for the mutant's fate or Mara's death. It offered no vindication. It simply was, and in its presence her pain was transformed. It was no longer a punishment, nor even a penance. It was a thread, a tangible connection spun from her own suffering, linking her bleeding back to that colossal, silent will. Her doubt had been a scream into a void she imagined was empty. This presence was the answer, not a voice to fill the silence, but the profound, deafening truth that the silence itself was full. It was heavy with purpose, a will so immense and patient that her mortal confusion was less than a mote of dust in its eye. The disciplina fell from her numb fingers, clattering on the stone. She could not lift her arm again. She knelt, swaying, her back a single, unified sheet of fire. The blood ran freely now, pooling on the floor beneath her knees. But the pain was distant, secondary. The golden light within her expanded, flooding her being with a certainty that was fiercer than any zeal, calmer than any peace. She had asked for a sign, for a voice. He had given her. This, the revelation that his language was not words but sacrifice. His presence was not in answers but in the unwavering courage to endure the questions. Her pain was not a cry into the void. It was a prayer in the native tongue of the Imperium, and it had been heard. With a strength that did not come from muscles, Sister Anya pushed herself to her feet. The movement tore fresh waves of agony from her ravaged back, but she embraced them. They were hers. They were her offering, and they had been accepted. She stood, naked and scourged, before the altar's flame. Her body was a map of pain, but her soul was scoured clean, annealed in the crucible of her own devotion. The doubt was gone, not answered, not resolved, but burned away in the fiery certainty of that overwhelming, silent presence. It had been a weakness, a flaw in the instrument. Now the instrument was tempered. She turned, her movements slow and deliberate, and looked at the discipline lying in her own blood. It was not a tool of punishment, it was a key. She did not don her shift. Let the wounds breathe. Let them scar. She walked from the chapel, leaving a trail of crimson droplets on the gray stone. The cold air on her torn flesh was a blessing. Each step was a prayer of gratitude. She was not just Sister Anya anymore. She was the vessel who had touched the silence and found it brimming with will. She was the instrument who had tested her own edge against the stone of doubt and found it unbroken. The faith that rose from that chapel floor was not the fervent zeal of the novice or the grim resolve of the veteran. It was something harder, brighter, and absolute. It was the faith of the scourged, who had learned that the Emperor's love was a forge, and his silence was the anvil upon which true devotion was hammered into being. The Cathedral of St. Celestine's Ascent was a fortress of faith carved into the living rock of the mountain, its vaulted ceilings soaring into darkness, its stained glass windows, depicting the saint's martyrdom in shards of crimson and cobalt. Now, those windows were shattered. The sacred silence was replaced by the deafening cacophony of war. The scent of incense and polished stone had been overwhelmed by the acrid stink of promethium, scorched ceramite, and blood. Heretics, a seething tide of fanatics clad in scavenged armor and daubed with hexagrammatic wards, poured through the blasted western doors, their howls of profane fervor echoing through the nave like the shrieks of damned souls. Sister Anya stood before the high altar, a massive slab of obsidian veined with gold, her bolter a roaring extension of her will. The weapon bucked in her hands, its muzzle flash painting the surrounding pillars in strobing light. Each shot was a punctuation in the litany of hate she chanted beneath her breath, each spent casing that clattered on the marble floor a bead on a rosary of death. Her world was the tunnel of her vision, the green targeting reticule dancing across. Heaving chests and snarling faces. They fell, one after another, their blood adding to the slick, dark patina spreading across the sanctified stones. But for every one that fell, two more clambered over the bodies, their eyes wide with a madness that mirrored her own zeal. Her bolter grew hot. The warning rune flashed on her retinal display, barrel temperature critical. The metal of the casing began to glow a dull cherry red, the heat bleeding through her gauntlets. The rhythmic crump of firing became labored, sluggish. A jam was imminent. She could feel the machine spirit's distress, a grinding tension in the weapon's heart. With a final, defiant burst that cut down a heretic aiming a rusted plasma pistol, the action locked solid, overheated, useless. She did not hesitate. With a practiced motion, she slammed the searing weapon into the magnetic clamp on her thigh. Its heat radiated through her armor plating. Her hand found the hilt of her chainsword, and with a pull, the weapon came to life. The sound was a rising, metallic snarl that cut through the din, a hungry, buzzing song that vibrated up her arm. It was the sound of her faith made audible, no longer the distant thunder of the bolter but the intimate tearing scream of close work. The heretics closest to the altar saw her weapon change and surged forward, sensing vulnerability. Anya met them. She was not defending now, she was claiming. Her first swing was a wide, horizontal arc. The chainsword's screaming teeth met flak plate, then flesh, then bone. It did not cut so much as excavate, throwing a red mist into the air. She stepped into the gap, her boots finding purchase on the bloody marble. A hymn was rising from somewhere deep in the cathedral, from a choir of surviving sisters holding the choir loft. It was the canticle of iron resolve, a deep, grinding melody played on pipe organ and thrumming through the voxnet. It was not the furious battle hymn of the streets. This was slower, heavier, the sound of a mountain refusing to move. Its echoes cascaded down from the vaults, wrapping around her, lending a terrible, majestic rhythm to her violence. Inspired, she led the charge. A wordless roar erupted from her vox grill. The sisters near the altar, those who still stood, saw her move and followed, a wedge of crimson ceramite and screaming steel driving into the heart of the heretic press. Her chainsword sang its devastating aria. It parried a crude axe, teeth chewing the haft to splinters before biting deep into the wielder's collarbone. She spun, using the momentum to disembowel another who tried to flank her. The hymn from above swelled, the organ notes like the footfalls of a titan. She was not just a sister fighting. She was a note in the cathedral's own defiant song, an instrument of its sanctity fighting back against the desecration. Then, the world turned to fire and thunder. A rocket, fired from a makeshift launcher in the shattered gallery, streaked down in a blur of smoke. It did not strike Anya. It struck the pillar just behind her left flank, where sisters Katerina and Evangeline had anchored the line. The explosion was a sun born in the heart of the cathedral. The sound was absolute, a pressure that punched Anya forward and deafened her audio pixceptors. Shrapnel, stone, metal, bone whistled past her like vengeful spirits. She was thrown to the ground, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. Her retinal display fizzed with static, then reset. As the ringing in her ears subsided to a high whine, she pushed herself up. Where the pillar had been was a smoldering crater. Of Katerina and Evangeline there were only fragments. A single, scorched pauldron bearing the fleur-de-lis lay in the rubble. A severed hand, still clad in a crimson gauntlet, gripped a broken bolter. The rest was ash and memory. The charge faltered. The heretics, emboldened, let out a triumphant howl. The wedge was broken. For a second, despair, colder than the mountain rock, threatened to seize her. It was the underhive, the mutant's plea, the demon's gaze, all the silent horrors rushing back, asking their terrible question. But the hymn from the choir loft did not stop. It grew louder, more defiant, the sisters above singing for the souls of the newly martyred, their voices weaving the tragedy into the tapestry of faith. And within Anya, the silence she had touched in the vigil chapel, that vast, purposeful presence, stirred. It offered no comfort, only a simple, immovable fact. The line must hold. She climbed to her feet. Her chainsword was still snarling in her hand. She turned to the 4 surviving sisters of her altar guard, their armor blackened, their faces behind their visors no doubt etched with the same shock. She pointed her blade not at the enemy but at the smoking crater, at the relics of their sisters. They have paid the price. Her voice, raw and amplified, cut through the din. This ground is sanctified by their blood. They hold it still. Will you let their sacrifice be in vain? For the emperor, for the ebon chalice, not one step back. It was not a request. It was a summoning of wills. The surviving sisters looked from the crater to her, and something hardened in their postures. The faltering line solidified. They closed ranks, their bolters, still functional, coming up, creating a killing zone before the altar. Anya planted herself at the center, her chainsword held high, a challenge etched in steel. The heretics came again. The fighting dissolved into a brutal, close-range slaughter. bolter fire interspersed with the shriek of chain blades. Anya fought with a cold, focused fury, every movement an act of remembrance for Katerina and Evangeline. She was no longer just defending a piece of stone. She was defending the meaning of their death. The hymn above and her silent, inner certainty became the twin pillars of her world. Just as the pressure seemed unbearable, as the heretic tide threatened to finally overwhelm their shrunken perimeter, a new sound echoed from the cathedral's eastern transept, the blessed, thunderous report of heavy bolters and the deep-throated roar of land raider engines. Reinforcements. The canoness herself, at the head of a full battle-sister squad, smashed through the barricaded side entrance, a wave of fresh, furious zeal. The heretics, caught between the anvil of the altar and the hammer of the relief force, broke. Their howls turned to panicked screams as they were cut down or fled back through the ruined doors they had come from. Silence returned, piece by piece, as the last echoes of gunfire faded. The hymn from the choir loft ended on a long, sustained note that hung in the smoky air before dissolving. The cathedral was saved, but it was saved stained. The magnificent marble floor was cracked and scorched, slick with gore. The air was thick with dust and the smell of death. The bodies of heretics and sisters alike lay intermingled before the altar. Anya lowered her chainsword, its teeth finally falling silent. She looked at the blackened crater, at the sacred space now forever marred by violence and loss. The blood of martyrs had once again been the seed. But as she stood amidst the devastation, the altar intact behind her, she understood the grim arithmetic of their faith. Sanctity was not preserved. It was constantly, bloodily reclaimed. And the price was etched into the very stones they prayed upon. The air in the sublevel shrine did not tear. It unfolded. One moment, the chamber was a scene of familiar desecration. Smashed reliquaries, defaced murals, the coppery stench of old blood. The next, the very substance of reality groaned under a weight it was never meant to bear. A vertical line of impossible blackness appeared in the center of the room, a slit in the fabric of the world. From that slit leaked not light, but a profound, hungry absence of it, and a sound like a million souls screaming through clenched teeth. Then, with a wet, ripping shudder, the rift widened. From that wound in existence it climbed. It was a sculpture of hatred given motion. 8 feet of corded, crimson muscle, slick as though freshly flayed, stretched over a frame of unnatural angles and brutal power. Its head was a nightmarish fusion of bull and insect, dominated by a pair of backward-curving horns of black bone, and a long, serrated snout filled with teeth like shards of rusted iron. In its 3-fingered claw, it clutched a blade that seemed forged from solidified rage, a hellblade that flickered with internal fire and dripped a steaming, acidic ichor that hissed where it struck the stone floor. Its eyes were pits of smoldering amber, holding not intelligence but a pure, focused essence of malice. This was a bloodletter, a foot soldier of the blood god, a fragment of eternal war made flesh. Its arrival warped the world around it. The chamber walls, once cold rockcrete, began to bleed. Thick, dark rivulets of a substance too viscid to be water seeped from the pores of the stone, tracing obscene patterns as they crawled downward. The air thickened, becoming a soup of palpable hate that coated the tongue and clawed at the lungs. It carried a psychic stench of battlefields where no quarter was given, of skulls piled high to the heavens, of rage so absolute it became the only truth. The temperature plummeted, yet the air felt feverish, charged with a static that made the fine hairs on Anya's neck stand erect beneath her gorget. Sister Anya stood her ground. She was the only one left in the chamber. The rest of her squad was holding the corridor outside against a surge of heretics drawn by the demon's birth cry. The orders had been clear: contain the rift. She was the containment. Her bolter felt like a child's toy in the face of this entity. Her chainsword's teeth seemed pitifully mundane, but she did not step back. The scourge marks on her back, still fresh beneath her armor, throbbed with a memory that was not of pain, but of the silent, golden presence that had answered it. That presence was here now, not as a comfort, but as an anchor. As the demon's baleful gaze locked onto her, she felt her faith manifest. It began as a pressure behind her eyes, a heat in her chest where her Rosarius lay against her skin. Then a faint, golden aura, visible only as a shimmer in the corrupted air, a distortion like heat haze emanated from her form. It was not a shield, it was a declaration. A tiny, defiant star asserting its reality against the howling unreality of the warp spawn. The bleeding walls seemed to recoil from it slightly. The hate-thickened air parted around her. The demon moved. It was not a charge. It was an eruption of violence. It crossed the 20 feet between them in a blur of crimson, its hellblade carving a shrieking arc through the tainted air toward her head. Anya threw herself sideways, the blade missing her by inches, its passage leaving a searing afterimage across her vision. The shockwave of its swing alone staggered her. It turned with impossible speed, its free claw lashing out. Ceramite screeched as talons scored deep grooves across her chest plate, the impact slamming her back against a bleeding wall. The breath exploded from her lungs. Ichor from the wall soaked into the scratches, sizzling as it tried to corrode the sacred armor. It leaned in, its bestial snout inches from her visor. Its breath was the smell of an abattoir left in the sun. And then the whispers came. They did not sound in her ears. They unfolded directly in her mind, slick and seductive, speaking in a voice that was a perversion of her own thoughts. Lay down your burden, see the truth of the galaxy. It is all war, all rage, all blood. Embrace it. You are already a killer. Let the killing be your joy, not your duty. Let the pain you inflict and endure be your ecstasy. The corpse god gives you only silence and sacrifice. We offer you power. We offer an end to the pain of thought, of doubt, of conscience. Become the pure instrument you wish to be, an instrument of slaughter for the sake of slaughter itself. It is the only true freedom. The promises were horrifying because they were built on a foundation of truth. She was a killer. She had endured pain. The Emperor's silence was a weight. The demon's vision offered a terrible, simple clarity, a universe stripped of meaning, where the only sacrament was violence and the only prayer was the scream of the dying. For a fractured second, the allure of that simplicity, of surrendering to the base fury she spent so much control to channel, was a tangible pull. But the scourge marks on her back burned anew, not with memory pain, but with the echo of the golden certainty that had followed. The demon promised an end to pain. The Emperor had asked her to transform pain into a bridge. The demon offered power without purpose. The Emperor had given her purpose that was heavier than any throne. Her voice, when it came, shook. It was the tremor of a mortal body pushed to its limit, vibrating with terror and adrenaline, but it was firm. It was a thread of sound woven from will alone. She began to recite the litany of exorcism, the ancient words of banishment and denial passed down through the ages. Her voice was a frail thing against the demon's psychic roar and the physical shriek of the warprift, but each syllable was a stone added to a bulwark. By the blood of the saints, by the ashes of the fallen, by the will of the undying Emperor, I deny you. This reality is not yours. This flesh is not your playground. This soul is not your feast. I cast you back into the howling dark from whence you came. I sever your claim. I break your form. In his name be unmade. As she chanted, the faint golden aura around her brightened. The demon flinched, its amber eyes narrowing as if the words were lances of light. It was not hurt, not yet, but it was annoyed. Its whispers turned to snarls of frustration. The promised power curdled into threats of exquisite eternal torment. It raised its hellblade again, the fire along its edge blazing brighter, ready to silence the irritating, shining gnat before it. Anya stood back against the bleeding wall, her body aching, her mind holding onto the litany like a lifeline in a tsunami of hate. The demon's visage filled her world, a living embodiment of the horror that had gazed from the shadows, now made terrifyingly, impossibly real. The battle was no longer for a chamber or even a world. It was for the sanctity of her own soul, and she would fight it with the only weapon she had left that the demon could not comprehend, a shaking voice, speaking words of faith into the face of absolute, smiling malice. The Hellblade descended, a comet of screaming malice aimed to cleave her from crown to pelvis. Anya did not try to parry. No mortal metal could withstand that demonic edge. She threw herself into a desperate, graceless dive, the blade shrieking through the air. Where she had stood and biting deep into the bleeding rockcrete floor with a sound like a mountain cracking, chunks of stone erupted. She rolled, her armor scraping through ichor and debris, coming up with her chainsword already revving in her hand. It was a mouse snarling at a tiger, but it was all she had. The demon wrenched its blade free and turned. Its movements were not merely fast. They were instantaneous eruptions of violence, defying physics with warp-born contempt. Anya fought not with skill, but with a frantic survivalist instinct honed by 1,000 drills. She ducked under a backhand swing that would have decapitated a space marine. She sidestepped a lunge, the Hellblade's tip scoring a line of molten fire across her pauldron. The heat bled through, searing the flesh beneath. Each near miss was a lesson in mortality, each blast of its foul breath a promise of oblivion. Her chainsword found its mark once, a glancing blow against the demon's thigh as she spun away from. Another attack. The screaming teeth met crimson hide that was tougher than plasteel. They chewed, sparked, and screamed in protest, throwing off a shower of metallic fragments and flecks of dark, burning blood. The demon barely flinched. It backhanded her with its free claw. The impact lifted her off her feet and sent her crashing into a shattered reliquary stand. Ceramite cracked. The breath was driven from her lungs in a pained gasp. Her vision swam, her retinal display flickering with damage runes. Ribs may be broken. The taste of blood filled her mouth. The whispers returned, slithering into the pain. See, your strength is nothing. Your faith is a crutch for a broken thing. Embrace the truth. Your pain can be power. Your rage can be eternal. Let go. Gasping, she pushed herself up. Her chainsword was dead in her hand, its motor shattered by the demon's hide. She let it fall. The golden aura around her, that faint shimmer of faith, had dimmed to a guttering candle flame beneath the overwhelming darkness of the entity. The demon paced towards her, a predator savoring the end. Its hellblade trailed along the floor, etching a smoking line in the stone. This was it, the glorious martyrdom she had once envisioned. But there was no glory here, only a cold, brutal extinction in a filthy, bleeding room. The canoness's words about the eternal choir felt like a fairy tale shouted into a hurricane. The demon's promises felt like the only honest thing in the universe, a universe of pain ending in more pain. Yet within that despair a final, stubborn ember glowed. It was not the fervent zeal of the novice, nor the grim resolve of the veteran. It was the silent, scorched certainty she had found on the chapel floor. The certainty that his language was sacrifice, that his presence was in the will to endure. She had offered her pain then, and it had forged a connection. She would offer her death now. The demon raised its blade for the final strike. Anya did not close her eyes. She met its smoldering amber gaze. She drew not on hatred, not on fury, but on the totality of her faith, every whispered prayer in the Schola's dark, every lash of the abbess's whip, every bolt fired, every mutant burned, every moment of doubt and its searing purification. She channeled it all, a lifetime of devotion and terror, into a single, focused point of will. It was a prayer without words, a final, desperate gift of her entire being. Her hand fell to her side, to the hilt of her power sword, a weapon she had rarely drawn, its spirit quieter, more solemn than the chainsword's rage. As her fingers closed around the grip, she thumbed the activation rune. The blade did not scream. It sang. A single, pure, resonant note that cut through the chamber's psychic shriek. Blue-white energy, clean and holy, cascaded down its length, a stark antithesis to the demon's fiery hellblade. The light was weak compared to the demon's aura, but it was real, a fragment of ordered reality in the chaos. The demon struck. The hellblade came down in a killing arc. Anya did not try to block. She lunged, a move of pure, suicidal commitment. She aimed not for the demon's heart, but for the wrist of its sword arm. She put every ounce of her weight, every shred of her focused faith into the thrust. The power sword met the demon's wrist. There was a cataclysmic flash of conflicting energies, the blinding white of the sanctified blade against the infernal red of demonic flesh. A sound like shattering crystal and tearing metal filled the world. The holy field of the power sword held for a critical microsecond, repelling the innate unreality of the demon before the physical edge bit deep. The hellblade, its murderous momentum severed, clattered from spasming fingers, its fires guttering. The demon's forearm, from which a steaming, blackish blood now fountained, hung by a thread of tendon and warp stuff. An unearthly, deafening screech of pain and fury erupted from the beast, sound that bypassed the ears to vibrate directly in the soul. The shockwave of that scream hurled Anya backward. She landed hard, her power sword skittering from her numb grip, her world reduced to ringing silence and blinding pain. The demon, maimed and enraged beyond reason, stumbled, clutching its seared stump. Its form flickered, the hold on its material presence destabilized by the wound inflicted by a weapon of true faith. It turned its raging gaze on Anya, intent on consuming her with teeth and claw before it was banished. It never got the chance. From the shattered doorway, a new light filled the chamber, a fierce golden radiance that pushed back the wall-bleeding gloom. Canoness Laura stood there, not in her ceremonial robes, but in her full, ancient battle plate. In her hands she held a relic, a massive, ornate warhammer, its head glowing with captured sunlight, its haft wrapped in scriptures of binding. She did not speak. She strode forward, each step a seismic event of pure authoritative faith. The demon, sensing a far greater threat, forgot Anya. It roared and charged the canoness, a bloody comet of hate. The canoness met the charge. She swung the relic hammer in a deceptively simple, terrible arc. It did not move fast, but it moved with the inevitability of a collapsing star. It connected with the demon's chest. There was no explosion of gore. There was a silent, profound unmaking. The demon's form did not shatter, it dissolved. Its crimson flesh turned to ash, its bones to motes of light that were instantly snuffed. Its final, fading screech was not of pain, but of impotent rage, a curse lost in the sudden, clean silence that rushed back into the chamber. The hellblade on the floor evaporated into acrid smoke. The bleeding walls ceased their flow. The rift in the center of the room snapped shut with a sound like a thunderclap, leaving only a scorched, eight-pointed star seared into the floor. The silence was absolute and profoundly deafening. Anya lay on her back, the world tilting nauseatingly. The ringing in her ears was a high-pitched, permanent whine, a physical scar left by the demon's death cry. Her body was a tapestry of agony, cracked ribs, seared shoulder, a dozen deep bruises, and the soul-deep fatigue that followed the expenditure of such absolute faith. Canoness Laura stood over the scorched mark, the glow of her hammer fading. She looked down at Anya, her ancient eyes assessing. She gave a single, slow nod. It was not praise. It was acknowledgement. A record entered in a divine ledger, instrument tested, not found wanting. Sisters rushed in, their boots crunching on the now dry debris. Hands lifted Anya, supporting her. The sounds of the battle outside reached her muffled, as if heard from deep underwater. The demon was gone, banished by sacred relic and the unwavering will of a living saint. But its visage was burned into Anya's mind. The horns, the smoldering eyes, the promise of a universe stripped of all but rage. and its screech was etched into her very being, a permanent tinnitus of the soul. As she was half carried from the chamber, she knew she was changed. The demon had shown her the absolute horror at the heart of the enemy's promise, and in her final, desperate lunge, she had touched the absolute truth at the heart of her own faith. It was not a shield against such horror, but a sword to meet it. The scar was not just on her ears or her body. It was on her spirit, a crack through which she had seen the abyss and had not blinked. She was scarred profoundly and permanently. But as the clean, cold air of the corridor hit her face, she took a shuddering, painful breath. The instrument was scarred, yes, but it was unbroken. Pain was a language Anya understood fluently. It spoke in the sharp, bright notes of broken ribs with each breath, in the deep, throbbing chorus of the burns across her shoulder and back, in the strange, hollow ringing that was now the permanent background noise of her hearing. The apothecarian of the forward bastion was a place of that language, spoken in the low moans of the wounded, the hiss of antiseptic sprays, and the crisp, clipped commands of the hospitaller sisters moving between the cots. The air smelled of astringent solutions, burned flesh, and the underlying iron scent of blood. She lay on a slab-like bed, her armor removed, her torso wrapped in sterile gauze and skin-graft skin. She was not among the worst wounded. She was mobile, her injuries painful but not mortal. As soon as the hospitaller had finished sealing the worst of the burns and binding her ribs, Anya rose. Her body screamed in protest, a symphony of agony, but it was a familiar score. Duty was the only analgesic that worked. She did not return to the barracks. Instead, she moved slowly through the rows of cots, a ghost in a simple underrobe, her steps careful on the cold plasteel floor. She fetched water for a sister whose arm ended in a cauterized stump. She held a basin for another who retched up black fluid, her insides scrambled by a psychic shockwave. She adjusted the pillow beneath the head of a young novice, her face pale as parchment, her eyes wide with a pain more spiritual than physical. It was in the eyes that Anya saw it. In the sister with the stump there was no despair, only a grim calculation of how to modify her combat style. In the one vomiting, a fiery, defiant anger burned through the nausea. And in the dying, for there were those here who would not see another dawn, she saw it most clearly. Sister Evangeline's Meltagun partner, a woman named Talia, lay in a cot by the wall. Her lower body was gone, consumed by the same rocket blast that had killed Katerina and Evangeline. The hospitallers had stabilized her, but the damage was too profound. Her life was measured in hours, sustained by fluid drips and sheer, stubborn will. Her eyes were open, clear and focused. Anya approached, drawn by that focus. Talia's gaze found hers. There was no plea in it, no fear of the dark. There was a light, a fierce, unyielding conviction that burned with a purity that made the sterile lumaglobe seem dim. It was the light of absolute certainty. Talia could not speak, her lungs too damaged, but her eyes communicated a complete, serene understanding. She had paid the price. She had bought a piece of the cathedral's safety with her blood and bone. The transaction was complete, and she was at peace with the balance. The light in her eyes was not the reflection of the room's lamps. It was an internal radiance, the glow of a faith so absolute it transformed the act of dying into an act of final, flawless testimony. It was the Emperor's light, reflected in the polished mirror of a soul that had achieved perfect, self-annihilating devotion. Anya stood there for a long moment bearing witness. The horror of the demon's visage, the ringing in her ears, the ache of her own wounds, they all receded before that silent, luminous stare. Talia was not departing into a void. She was completing a circuit, her life energy flowing back into the vast, silent battery of the divine will. Her light did not extinguish, it was being transferred. Later, in a quiet corner of the apothecarian where the groans were faintest, Anya knelt. It was not a formal prayer posture. Her body would not allow it. She simply bent her head, her hands resting on her knees. She did not recite a litany. She did not ask for strength or healing or forgiveness. The words of the Schola, the convent, the battlefield, felt like clumsy things, like trying to describe a sunset with a vocabulary of grunts. Instead, she opened herself to the silence within, the silence that had answered her scourging, the silence that had been in the cathedral when the hymn ended, the silence that had been at the core of Talia's luminous gaze. She let the pain of her body flow into that silence. She let the memory of the demon's screech dissolve into it. She offered the haunting afterimage of the mutant's pleading eye, the weight of Mara's body, the searing heat of her overheated bolter, all the fragments of horror and doubt that still clung to her soul. And in that profound, internal quiet she felt it. Not a voice, not a vision, a connection. It was as if she were a single nerve ending in a body of galactic scale. She could feel the steadfast courage of the wounded around her, Talia's peace, the defiant anger of the vomiting sister, the grim determination of the amputee. She could feel, as a distant, rhythmic pulse, the unwavering faith of the sisters standing watch on the bastion walls, and the canoness in her strategy chamber, her will a bedrock. These were not separate sparks. They were points of light in a vast, interconnected constellation, a neural network of devotion, each act of courage, each endured pain, each silent prayer strengthening the whole. This was the Emperor's presence. Not a bearded king on a distant throne, but this living, breathing, bleeding tapestry of collective will, this immense, silent engine of faith that powered the Imperium's defiance against the night. He was not in the words. He was in the courage. Not in the answering of prayers, but in the strength to keep praying when no answer came. His light was not a beacon in the sky. It was the reflection in the eyes of the dying, the fire in the heart of the living, the unbreakable line held in his name. A profound calm settled over Anya, deeper than any battle trance, more solid than any zeal. The scars on her soul, the ringing in her ears, the aches in her body, they were not flaws. They were her unique calibrations within the great instrument. They were how she connected to the whole. A hospitaller touched her shoulder. "Your secondary grafts are ready, sister. Your squad has been re-equipped. They await you in the muster yard." Anya rose. The movement still hurt, but the pain was now just data, a report from a functional component. She submitted to the quick, efficient application of the synth skin to her back and shoulder. She donned a fresh undersuit, then her armor. The servos whined as they sealed, the familiar weight settling onto her shoulders like a returning part of herself. She checked her new bolter, its machine spirit quiet and untested. She sheathed a fresh chainsword at her hip. Walking from the apothecarian into the gray light of the muster yard, the change was palpable. The air was cold and smelled of wet stone and promethium. Her squad was there, diminished but resolute, their armor scrubbed clean of soot, their postures straight. Sister Superior Helena nodded to her. No words of welcome were needed. Her presence was the report. Anya took her place in the line. She felt the lingering soreness, heard the eternal, high-pitched whine in her ears. But beneath it, thrumming in time with her heartbeat, was the silent, golden connection. She had seen the light in the eyes of the dying. She had felt the constellation of faith. The demon had shown her the horror at the heart of the warp. Now she carried the quiet, immovable truth at the heart of the Imperium. The mission bell clanged, a harsh, urgent sound. The next war awaited in another district, another hive, another world forever teetering on the brink. Sister Anya of the Ebon Chalice checked the load on her bolter one final time. She was healed, not because her wounds were gone, but because she understood their place in the great, silent song. She was ready. The instrument, scarred and tuned by horror, was once again prepared to play its part in the eternal, bloody symphony of the Emperor's will. The wind on the parapet was a clean, cold blade, scouring away the lingering stench of promethium and voided bowels that still haunted the lower city. It carried the scent of ozone from the atmosphere processors and the distant, mineral tang of the newly liberated world's northern tundra. Below, in the vast, ash-floored drill yard of the bastion of the redeemed, a new crop of novices moved through their forms. Their power armor was unscarred, their movements precise yet still retaining a hint of conscious thought, a fractional delay between order and execution that spoke of training, not yet of instinct. Sister Anya watched them from her post high on the bastion's western wall. The watch was a veteran's duty, a silent communion with the horizon. Her armor, once the vibrant crimson of fresh ceramite, was now a darker, almost blackish hue, its surface a topography of minute scratches, impact pocks, and the faint, ghostly discolorations of acid burns and psychic scorching that no polish could fully erase. The fleur-de-lis on her forehead was a pale, raised scar. The brand on her shoulder ached in the cold, a familiar, grounding throb. In the novices below, she saw phantoms. The girl drilling with the heavy bolter, her stance a fraction too wide, was the ghost of Sister Mara, fierce and overeager. Another, correcting her grip on a chainsword after a stumble, wore the same determined grimace Anya had seen in her own reflection in the Schola's polished floors. They were raw, unbloodied clay, awaiting the forge of their first drop, their first kill, their first loss. They still believed faith was a shield. They had yet to learn it was a weapon, and that to wield it was to be cut by its hilt. Her gaze drifted from the drill yard to the sprawling, war-wounded city beyond the bastion walls. Sanctity had been reclaimed here as it had been in the cathedral at a cost measured in sisters' lives. The spires still smoked in places. The silence was not peace but exhaustion. Liberation was not an end. It was a pause, a comma in the endless sentence of war. The horrors unspooled in her mind not as traumatic flashes but as a curated archive. The wet crump of her first bolter kill. The silent gurgle on Mara's vox. The mutant's single, intelligent eye pleading from the fire. The demon's smoldering gaze and the soul scarring. Shriek of its banishment. The luminous peace in Talia's dying eyes. Each was a lesson, a verse in the brutal liturgy of her service. The faith that sustained her was no longer the fervent, hungry thing of the orphanage, nor the drilled-in certainty of the convent. It was something quieter, harder, and more durable. It was the faith of the scarred. It did not promise glory or explain suffering. It simply was the bedrock upon which she stood, the reason to take the next breath, to fire the next bolt, to hold the next line. It was the silent, golden thread she had felt in the apothecarian, connecting her to every other suffering, striving soul in the Emperor's vast and bleeding empire. A soft chime sounded in her helm, a priority alert from the bastion's surveyor array. Her retinal display flickered, overlaying her view of the city with tactical data. A pulsating crimson rune appeared on the edge of the scanned zone, 30 kilometers out in the rad-scarred Badlands. Energy signatures. Inconsistent with natural phenomena or imperial tech. Low-level, scattered, but moving, coalescing. The alert was not urgent, not yet. It was a whisper from the void, a reminder. The vigil was never just about watching the quiet. It was about listening for the moment the quiet broke. Anya did not sound the general alarm. She shifted her weight, the servos in her armor emitting a soft whir. Her gaze remained on the horizon where the rune pulsed. She reached down, her gauntleted fingers finding the familiar, heavy shape of her bolter where it rested against the parapet. With a series of practiced, ritual motions, she ejected the magazine. It was full. She slammed it home again, the solid click-chunk a satisfying punctuation in the wind. Her thumb found the safety rune, toggling it off, then on, then off again, a tactile confirmation of readiness. Below, the novices concluded their drill. A sister superior barked an order and they formed up, a neat, crimson block, their heads held high. They marched towards the bastion's great gates, perhaps for a field exercise, perhaps for their first real deployment. Anya watched them pass beneath her position. One of them, the one with the chainsword, glanced up. Their eyes met through visor and distance for a fleeting second. The novice's head snapped back forward, posture stiffening. Anya returned her attention to the horizon. The crimson rune on her display had not vanished. It pulsed slowly, a heartbeat of approaching threat. She knew the protocols. She would report the contact. The canoness would dispatch scouts. Perhaps it was nothing, a rogue servitor herd, a band of survivalists. Or perhaps it was the first probing tendril of the next heresy, the next mutation, the next demonic whisper. It did not matter. The specifics of the horror were interchangeable. The duty was constant. Sister Anya settled back into her watch, the wind plucking at the edges of her cloak. The novices were gone, swallowed by the bastion. The city lay in its exhausted silence. The rune glowed on the edge of the world. Her finger rested beside the trigger guard of her loaded bolter. The vigil continued. And so she knew, with a calm as deep as the void between stars, would the horror. They were eternal partners in a dance that would only end when she, or the galaxy itself, was finally still. Until then, she would watch. She would wait. And when the silence broke, she would be ready to answer it with fire and faith.